Good morning. My name is Erica, and I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for our Hyperion Financial Reporting webinar. We'll be kicking off the webinar in just a minute. I just wanted to go over a couple things for everyone to know. We will be muting all participants today, but you'll notice on the right-hand navigation there's a question and actually a chat box. If you have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the box, and any questions for the presenter we'll address at the end of the webinar, and any concerns, other concerns I will help address while it's going on. If we run out of time and we're unable to get to your question, we'll be sure to have someone from our team follow up with you afterwards. Also, we'll be making all of the slides and the recording from today's webinar available for you to download from our website following the webinar. We are excited to have Kristy here with us today to share her knowledge on the topic. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Kristy.
Thanks, Erica. So as Erica mentioned, my name is Kristy Koza. I looked through the registration list and I recognized some names. Some of you I've worked with in the past and some are new names, but welcome to all and thank you for attending today's session. A little bit about myself for those of you who don't know me. I have been a consultant working with Hyperion Planning and S-Base and Financial Reports for the last 10 years. And before that, my background is I was a finance manager in mainly in the telecommunications industry using Hyperion products as a business user. So I am quite familiar with kind of both sides, both the consulting side and the technical side, but also from a user standpoint. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. A few slides on just Emtec overall. We have a 20-plus year Oracle focus. We are a platinum partner with Oracle. We have around 800 consultants worldwide, 1,000 on-premise clients. We are also building our cloud client base. We run a cloud environment internally, and that is what I'll be presenting from, as we'll see here in a little bit. We have 4 different focus areas. So our advisory group, in general, this group helps clients make pre-project decisions regarding what is the best software, what is the best module to use. Our applications and infrastructure groups, these are the teams that actually implement our solutions. And then our analytics team provides support for what-if solutions. Our agenda today is we'll have a brief introduction to the topics. We'll talk about design considerations, metadata structures, text and commentary, charts and reports and how they work together, and then we'll finish off with discussing some creative solutions. So as a report developer myself, I know at times working with financial reports can be a challenge. You have a requirement from a client, or you have your own internal requirements, and it might sound simple, it might seem straightforward, but when you start to get into the details and actually start to build a report, you might find that there are some limitations. So during today's session, what I'd like to do is I'll share with you some of the various design concepts myself and my team have run into in the past, and we'll talk about some examples. I'll be doing an actual demo showing you within Web Reporting Studio, how exactly it's done, and hopefully this will make your reports as dynamic and flexible as possible. So a few design considerations. I know we have a lot of bullet points here on this slide, but I think all of them are important. First of all and foremost is I cannot stress enough how important it is to get standardized templates. Sitting down with all the business users to get simple things, they sound simple, font sizes, headers, footers, everything that makes up a report layout. It's important to get these things nailed down in the beginning, because you don't want to get to a point where all of a sudden you've built out many reports, and then the requirement changes. Oh, we don't know, don't like how that looks, or as one example. So the sooner that these can be standardized upfront in the report building process will, help reduce maintenance of having to go back and touch reports. And that's sometimes a challenge, if there are many organizations involved and they might already have existing reports in Excel, usually, that they are used to a certain look and feel. So it's worth the effort to put in the time in the beginning to try to get everybody in alignment on how the reports will look. Some other design considerations: if your rows or columns in the grid contain multiple dimensions, put the dense dimensions first. This will help somewhat with performance. For any what I call system dimensions, which are maybe used for administrative purposes, and this could be something like a data source dimension that contains all the different layers of your allocations methodology. Sometimes some of the dimensions that are built into an application don't, quote unquote, make sense to the end user, and they're really for system purposes. So for these type of dimensions, I would recommend setting it at the grid point of view, and then hiding the grid point of view so that these dimension members don't either confuse or cause questions from the end users. Minimize the number of dimensions in the grid, again, utilizing either the grid point of view or the user point of view, or hard code and hide dimensions that, as I mentioned, are for system use. Also utilize substitution variables to minimize selections for the user. And this could be, most standard are things like current month, current year, current period, or budget year, and those sort of things. So take advantage of that capability. Using the same as feature within the member selection. So if all your columns or many of your columns would be a similar dimension member, let's say actual or budget, or the current period, this can minimize maintenance if you have to go back into a report and change that column or row. Another recommendation is to use the grid point of view to limit page dimension members. I'm just keeping in mind that anything in that drop-down menu in that page area, it all runs at runtime. So if it's a long list of dimension members, then that could have performance impacts. Some alternatives to think about are either putting that dimension in the point of view, which would be one at a time. If it's necessary to run multiple dimension members, then I would recommend either creating a book or a batch, or possibly both. The use of prompts to allow users to select from a limited list. Sometimes we have hierarchies in a dimension that are, have many different, there's the main hierarchy, there might be several alternate hierarchies. For an end user who's maybe not using the system or running reports every day, that might get confusing about, well, what do I pick? What do I select? So using the prompt feature, you can set up a list that makes the most sense to an end user. Another consideration is using related content. This is a way to guide the user interaction through the reports, basically providing them with a drill path, if you will. So in my experience, what I've done is, let's say I, have a standard income statement type of report that's a higher level, kind of an overall organization type of view. And within that report, your standard P&L lines. So I might have a row for my travel and expense or my office supply expense. And what this related content can do is you create a link, and then from that link takes the user to a more detailed report that might have, a completely different dimension layout that gives, just a different view and more insight into, the certain line items on that report. So that's just one example. And then overall, it sounds obvious, but always consider the user experience. Some of your users might be new, they might need training, they might not be familiar with the terminology that's being used. So always kind of take care to explain, point of view. What is that? What is a prompt? What is the difference between the two? And that just in general, I think, helps with the user interaction with reports. Another recommendation I would have regarding setting preferences specific to financial reports is to have users set their preview point of view to on. The default is off, and if an end user is running a report for the first time, the way that the system works, as y'all probably know, is that it defaults to the top of the house. And usually this causes the report to hang, not run at all, either because it's a large report, it's a large intersection, or because of security. Most users are not going to have security access to that higher level member. And this gets back to the user experience. The report doesn't run, or it takes a very long time if it runs at all, and the user thinks the report is broken. So which, obviously we don't want that to happen. So having the preference for the preview point of view set to on forces them to select. When they run a report in Workspace, they'll get a pop-up window, and they'll have to go through that member selection process. Okay. So today will be, I have pre-built just a standard, very basic P&L grid, and that's what I'll be using. I have one that's pre-built and then one that's in progress, which is where I'll be doing a demo out of, the demonstration, and showing you what that looks like. Some general points that I have about formatting. I like to use gray font to indicate a hidden row or a column, or I've seen other developers use color coding. Just some type of visual indicator as a report writer will make your life easier. So when you go into a grid, into a web reporting studio or financial reporting studio, you'll quickly be able to see what's a hidden row or column versus what's actually going to get displayed on the report. Another little trick I use, and I can show you the example when we get into the grid, is when using parentheses for negative numbers, this causes numbers to not align perfectly if you just go with the default. A little trick I have is in the positive area is to put a space, so that kind of forces all the numbers then to align. And last point under formatting is be conscious of overlapping formats that might cancel each other out. And these aren't always evident in the format editor, unfortunately. So things like borders and shading and things like that, mostly borders, is you're looking in the format editor, you think you have a border set, you can see that it's there, but it's not showing up in the report. And these are the little things that I find is, always seem to take the longest time to figure out. So just, something to keep in the back of your mind. As mentioned before, use as much dynamic references as possible, such as the same as the current point of view in the member selection, substitution variables, the various member functions that are available within Reporting Studio as well. So with that, I am going to switch over to, I already have, hopefully I'm still logged in over here. So I've already brought up this report. This is my working version of the report. Here I have run the final product. So this is what we'll be working towards getting to here today. So we have, just as I mentioned, very simple type of P&L up at the top. We have the month on the left and the year-to-date on the right. Our comments are right below the grid here. Then I have a reference here. This is actually referencing the chart data, but summarizing it at a quarter level, whereas the chart is showing the monthly trend. So that's the finished product. I'm going to switch back over to Workspace to show you the working version. So here you can see there are a few more columns that are being shown. So I'll walk you through what those are when we get to those specific topics in our slides, which I'll go back to. So the first topic I would like to talk about is how to use metadata to facilitate reporting. I think a lot of the time we find ourselves in report building situations where something about the outline, the metadata, does not easily support development of reports. So we often find ourselves making workarounds, creating complex report formulas within the actual grid itself, or hard coding reports. So, none of those are ideal. That can cause many reports to be out there in Workspace Explorer, and then a user could be looking at all these folders, not know what report do I run, which one is the best one for me, which one applies to me, and this gets back to the user experience. So we want to make the reports as efficient as possible and streamline them so that templates can be used instead of hard coding reports for every different department, as an example. So a better solution is to build this within the outline in the metadata to make the reports dynamic. But this requires an overall holistic approach to the design. And by that, what I mean is that working together with the application developer, maybe that is yourself, maybe it's another person from your team, but working closely to collaborate and come up with, within the system itself, what is the best design to support both the application and also report development. So a few examples of this is using dynamic member formulas, creating dimension members, and these could be within different dimensions depending on the needs. And so the examples I have here are a percent of sales calculation, which is the example that I'll be walking you through here in a moment, and also statistical accounts to do the calculations within the system itself. And what that does is it also provides for having a consistent formula. So, this user versus another user, we're not using different formulas, different math to come up with what we think is the same answer. And that just, again, provides a single version of the truth. Other examples of metadata capabilities, you could use user-defined attributes, UDAs, attribute dimensions, build alternate hierarchies for different roll-ups to enable more efficient reporting, and also smart lists. Okay, so with that, let me switch back over to Web Reporting Studio, or actually, I'm going to go back to Workspace for a minute. And so in the example that I mentioned, I have a percent to actual and a percent to budget. And what these scenario members, so I put this in the scenario dimension, but again, the dimension that you put these in might vary depending on what the needs are. But in this case, I put them in the scenario dimension, and what these calculations do is for every row on a report, it's going to calculate that line item, what percent of sales is it. And so I've encountered this at a few different clients, and it had initially started out with a report formula, but then it tends to get very specific because you have to call certain rows, and again, that could have a tendency to break, it's maintenance, and so just found a better solution is to do it within the outline itself. So I'll go into the member properties just to show you an example of what that member formula looks like. It's very simple in this case. Depending on how your application is built, it might get a little bit more complicated. But what this does is just says, okay, whatever my actuals for whatever row I'm on, expenses or revenue or whatever it might be, divide it by the sales. So this sample application plan demo, A50,000 is my product sales dimension member, and divide by where the actuals are. And so what that looks like in a report is, so I have pulled up here, this is my working version of my report. And again, we're in the cloud environment, so this is Web Reporting Studio. It's not the client. And another point I wanted to make here is make the switch. It's almost like for those of you who are familiar with going from the S-Base add-in to SmartView, it's a little bit of a change. It's a different look and feel. What I would recommend everybody to, start, if you are a report developer, to start to get into using the web version. All the functionality is, as far as I have found so far in just doing some of my own training, creating the content for this webinar, I have found all the functionality to be the same. So it shouldn't be any different except for the initial interaction. And navigation is a little bit different. So as you can see here, all the objects are shown that are within the report. I have a header, I have my main grid, I have my chart, I have a hidden grid that's driving the chart data. But from here, this initial on open, you're not able to edit any of these objects. You would have to click on the object within the repository over here. And so if I click on grid 1, it now brings up edit mode for my grid. So within my report, column C and E, and then over on the year-to-date, the equivalents G and I, are my two scenario members that I created, the percent to actual and the percent to budget. The example that I gave you before about the format with the parentheses, here on the percent column, you can see, might be hard to see on the screen, I'm not sure how small it is, but I have a percent sign and then a space. And then in the negatives, I have the percent sign and the closed paren. And so what that will do is when the report runs, my numbers align very nicely. They don't get, that ragged look. So when the report runs, I'll show you an example. So what this does, make it a little bit bigger. So my product sales are 100% of itself. My labor is 15.26, and so on and so forth, all the way down the line. The next topic I would like to go over is text and commentary. So this is a common request from a lot of clients that I've worked at, the need for variance explanations on reports. It's gotten a little bit easier over the years. It used to be quite a challenge, but now it's fairly straightforward, which is great. And what we do here is we, again, use a metadata member that's going to hold this information. I'm using the account dimension to store that member. I'll show you that in the outline. So if I go to the account dimension, I have stat accounts, and my very last member here is just very simply called comments, and it's a stored member. And then what I have is a form that's used for the entry. Again, here, just very simplistic, very basic form. I have some variance explanation in there already, just so we can see how this flows through. I'll change those comments and then save. And then within my report, I have a column set up that is pointing to the intersection, the same intersection that the form is storing the comments at. So that here is column A. So February, actual, final, no product. This is just the dimensions within the plan demo application. And then here on row 15 is where I am actually pulling in that comments member from the account dimension. And the intersection is going to display, I've merged it all the way across the bottom of that report. But I don't want to see all the data from column A because it really, that piece of information is not telling me anything basically in this report. So there's two ways that we can do this. First way is just to simply make the font white. That masks it, which I'll go ahead and use that method. The other method would be to actually hide column A, and then starting in column B, for instance, is using the get cell member function is to pull the correct intersection in. So it's really, one's not better than the other, I don't think. It's just two different ways to go about it. And if you have any experience with financial reports, you know there are usually several different ways to do the same thing or achieve the same outcome. So let me go ahead and save this report, and then we'll go ahead and go back to Workspace to run that report again. Going to update, refresh. Here's my preview point of view, what I mentioned earlier about setting that in preferences. Just going to accept the last dimension members I ran the report for. And here you can see my updated comments. I just said test for the webinar. But of course, in a real life situation, you would be typing in your comments, your specific comments. Just a note here, comment entry is at the level 0, the way that this is set up. And comments don't roll up, so it's not, like a hierarchy. If I enter at a level 0 of a department, if I look at the parent of that department, it's not going to show me the rolled up numbers. It's just not the way that this is designed. I have run into a situation where there was a need to enter comments at an upper level. And the way that we worked around that or solved that is we put the comments as a member in the version dimension and used a target version versus a bottom up, which allowed then the users to enter at an upper level. But again, they had in the form, the users had to select that upper level and put the specific comments there. The level 0s won't roll up. Okay, going back to the slides. So now I want to get into reports and charts. In my experience, a lot of the time charts aren't used either because they are seen as complex or not robust enough. I wanted to talk about a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses because there are strengths in charts, and they are, a valuable visual aid that can support your grid data. Nothing, speaks like a picture. There are a variety of chart formats, line, bar, pie, etc. It does allow you to show data from, as an example, one data source in the chart and another data source in the grid. So if you have multiple databases and need to represent that, that's a great way to do that. You can reuse that chart object once you have it set up and formatted exactly as you want it to be. I did have one example where we had 15 different chart objects in one report, which gets to be a lot. And so this chart object, saving it off as a saved object, really helped make sure that all of those 15 objects were, had a consistent look and feel, consistent size within that report, just so from a visual aspect, it looked good. There are some limitations. It's, definitely not as robust as Excel charts. I mean, it's not Excel. So there are some limitations there, but it has gotten improved over the years, I think, in terms of the resolution has gotten better. with the on-premise 11.124, I know that the chart engine has been upgraded, and so that would certainly help with some of the resolution issues that I myself have seen in the past. And so one example here that I wanted to go through is there's definitely lots that you can do with charts. We won't be able to cover everything here, but this is a solution that I've used in multiple client engagements where the chart line drops to the axis in the empty months or where there are no actuals. And just from a visual perspective, it just doesn't look good, first of all. So I'll show you what the example of that is. So here you can see in my working report where I have actuals for January and February, but then the rest of the year, it goes to 0. So again, from a visual, that just is not appealing. So the way to get around that is in the grid where my chart data is getting driven from, which is grid 2 in this case. What I'm going to do is apply conditional format to both the actual and the budget line that says if the current cell value in that row is equal to 0, and I'm going to add 2 more conditions. And my second one is going to say or, and they're all ors. So, and then if my current cell value is no data pound missing, or if my current cell value is an error, I'm going to replace that. So in my format, clicking the format cells, I'm going to use the replace feature, which is the last tab. I'm going to type the word null. And so what happens when the report runs, it doesn't actually display the word null. It treats that null as a blank, essentially. So when the report runs, the line just stops wherever the actuals are, and it doesn't drop to the bottom. I'm just saving that, and I'll go ahead and run it here, this time out of Web Reporting Studio. Get my POV. And here you can see where the line just stops. It doesn't go to the bottom of the axis. So I just think it looks better. So one trick, you might have known about it before or maybe not. So hopefully that, if you didn't know, it helps you out. The next example I'd like to talk about is a scenario where you have dual grids. You're needing to cross-reference from one grid to another grid, and this might be because of various reasons. One grid might be pointed at database 1, the other might be pointed at database 2, and you need to combine those two into the same grid. The other example, the example I'm going to show you here, is where in the chart I have my months, but in my grid I wanted to display at the quarterly level, just a more summarized level, just to give another view. So the syntax is here, so it would be grid X, X representing the grid name. If you've renamed your grids from grid 1, grid 2, etc., then that is the name that would go here instead of grid X. And then you specify your row, column, or page reference. So for example, here I'm going to reference grid 2, which is my hidden grid that contains the chart data. And it's in row 1, or it could be in column B, or you could have a combination of the two. I'm going back to my working report, and back in grid 1, And here I have all the syntax set up. So I'm in the Q1 actual expenses column. And you can see up here in the formula bar, I already have that syntax laid out. And I just need to add it here in my budget Q1. So I could type it in or just copy it down. And I need to change the reference to row 2 because that's where my budget is contained in that hidden grid. And verify it. And save it. I'm going to run it again. And then when this runs, I will have the Q1 budget data showing in my main grid. So a very simple example, but I have run into several situations where I had to use that cross-reference feature, using a hidden grid. You might also have this set up, a hidden grid, if you have things like a rolling, either monthly report or rolling quarters. That might also come in handy. Okay, to touch on report books a little bit, there's definitely lots that we can do with report books. The one example I wanted to walk through here is adding a cover page. And so I'm not sure if everybody knows about this feature. It's not brand new. It's been around for the last couple of versions. But it is a nice feature because by default, a book will put the table of contents as the first page, which, again, from a visual aspect, is not maybe always that appealing. And so what we have now is this feature to add a cover page, and this is done within the book editor. So the first step would be you'll need to import either a Word or a PDF. In the cloud, it's limited to a Word or PDF. I know that on-premise, you can also use a report as your cover page, so you would just lay it out with the text fields that have the name of your book and that sort of thing. So just a very basic type of report. But in the cloud, it's either a Word or a PDF. So you'd import that into Workspace, which is done via File, the File menu, and then Import, and then File. And you'd browse to wherever you have your Word or PDF saved. I already have it imported, but you would just walk through the steps and the prompts. And then in whatever folder you had selected is where your cover page will be. And then in the book editor, so what I have here is I've already gone ahead and added 2 reports, my final, my working, and then also the cover page. So when I click on cover page, you can see down here at the panel at the bottom, you have a selection, a drop-down that says, is cover page yes or no? So in this case, you would select yes, and what that does is automatically puts that cover page document or PDF as the first object in the book. One point to note, if you are working with on-premise, this required a little modification of the XML to actually get it to be the first object. I believe it's just a bug that even though we said is cover page yes, it still was putting the cover page after the table of contents. So what I did there is exported the XML, and there's a flag in all of that code that says is cover page equals 0, or which means it's not the cover page, or cover page equals 1, which means yes, it is the cover page, and changed that in the XML and then re-imported it back into Workspace, and that did the trick, and it put the cover page as the first object and when the report ran, it was the first thing that was displayed. Okay, and so lastly here, a few bullet points. I'm not going to go through a demo of each of these today. These are just some other situations, some other ideas for you to think about as you go through developing reports, things that I've used in the past pretty successfully. If you have worked with charts at all, you are probably familiar with changing the decimal precision in charts. Again, this requires exporting the DES file, exporting it out of Workspace, pulling it up in Notepad or any type of text editor, and modifying the XML. There's a lot of documentation online regarding what the syntax for this is. I also have it, and feel free to reach out to me. My contact information will be here at the end, and I can definitely share that with you. Using multiple charts in a report, as I mentioned before, in one situation I had up to 15 charts in a report, which was a lot, and it was a lot to manage and make sure it was aligned correctly and positioned, and when it ran nicely. Third bullet point here, using multiple grids with the different data sources, touched on that point. Aligning color schemes in a combo chart. So combo being bars and lines together. Had a situation where the color requirement was very specific. It was that the actual line had to be blue with a diamond symbol, and target, for example, had to be red with a triangle, and there were some other different variations regarding that. And in the what we had to do to get the colors to go in the right order, because FR just automatically goes to the next and goes to the next, and so basically the colors were not displaying as desired. The solution here was to add in between basically placeholder rows that were formulas that were hidden, and essentially what this did is it tricked FR into treating that as a data point and applying the color that we didn't want to see, and then forcing it to move on to the next element style that we did want to see. Had a situation here, the next bullet point, where we used special characters to display symbols in a grid. So this was to replace the legend in the chart. With the on-premise version, the chart was stacking the legend items one on top of each other. We couldn't get it. It's not available out of FR to display them horizontally, and it was just taking up a lot of real estate in the chart itself. So when I say special characters, it was wingdings and webdings, and there were some modification that had to be done to some files on the server. So this is why I say really only applies to on-premise, because in the cloud we don't have access to that. Another thing to think about is using conditional formatting in various ways. The example I have here is to evaluate results against targets or other type of comparisons. Definitely a lot that you can do with conditional formatting. I've done some pretty involved, complex comparisons where there was like 12 different conditional formats set up. So testing that, yes, takes a little time, but it was pretty interesting what we did there. I mentioned before about rolling month or rolling quarter type of reports. And again, if you have developed reports and this is a requirement, you're probably familiar with this, using trigger columns and conditional suppression based on the period, for instance, that's selected in the POV would drive which columns show versus which don't. And again, this is one that there's pretty extensive documentation online regarding how to set this up. Again, I also have this information, and feel free to reach out to me if you have specific questions. One that I've been using recently, a feature that's been in FR for probably as long as I can remember, is the auto calculation. So I've been using this for a recent requirement to insert dynamic subtotals and averages within a report, again, dynamically, to display those subtotals instead of actually having to put a report formula into the report itself. And then finally, I mentioned before, using the related content feature. If you get it set up and think about the flow from a summary to a more detailed, and maybe even from that detailed report to an even more detailed report, it can really enhance the user interaction with reports. So they don't have to go out to Workspace Explorer or a task list and try to find what is the report that I want, which is the right one for me. It just provides them kind of that guided analytics type of experience. Okay, so Erica, I don't know if we have questions that are lined up, but ready for Q&A?
We do, yes. The first question is, customers need to report on comments that are inputted into planning during the budget forecast cycle. In your experience, how can this be best achieved, especially when looking at data in an aggregated level?
Okay, so this is actually ties in pretty perfectly with the example that I had shown. Is what we did is set up, in this case, in the account dimension, but it could really be in any other dimension depending on how the application is designed. But it was set up as a text member and as a stored member, so that within the form, then we could pull it in as that intersection and input the data. Regarding the aggregated level, that would have to, again, comments don't roll up, so the solution that we had for that one was to put that comments member into a version dimension, and using the target version for that member, we're able to allow users to enter at upper levels.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. The next question, okay, referring to the building of the formulas into the application, does that functionality does not exist in HFM, correct?
I would have to get back to you on that. I am not an HFM expert by any means. I'm more on the planning and essay side, but I can take that question back and we can post those answers, or however we want to do that.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll contact you to get that answer. Next question, can you please further discuss the benefits of using grid POV? Is it just to hard code selections into the report, or does it truly improve performance?
It can potentially improve performance, and where I would recommend using the grid point of view is if you have single member dimensions that you want to set up. So they are hard-coded in the sense that they are set in the POV, but the main purpose of using that grid point of view is to set it to that single member instead of having, every row or column specify that same member. So that's could potentially be a slight overhead if you have it in the row or the column. So that's the benefit of using the grid point of view. Also, with the grid point of view, you can hide it so that if you don't want the end users to see some of these, what I call system members, then it's a nice way just to set it within the report, and they don't have to worry about making those member selections.
All right, great, thank you. Next question, our company runs into an issue of running report books when admin runs exact same book with exact same POVs versus non-admin, and they get different results. Have you or your clients experienced a similar issue? The only way to correct this, we found, is when non-admin opens every single report from the book and sets POVs at an individual level.
So that's an interesting one. So I guess what I'm getting from that is the data comes out differently. The first thing that I would think about there is it a security setting that is because of an admin usually obviously has a higher level of security than the typical end user. So I would, first place I would look is it apples, you know, are we really looking apples to apples, or is it truly something within the report itself, the report design that needs to be looked at? Because getting different results for the same intersection sounds obvious. It doesn't sound right to me.
Okay, great, thank you. We have another one. With the Financial Reporting Studio eventually phasing out, what is the best strategy for rapidly learning the financial web reporting tool for PBCS? Is all FRS functionality available in FWR?
It is, so far, as I mentioned, in developing the content for this webinar, but also just, you know, basically playing around in our internal cloud environment, I have found that yes, all the same functionality is there. You know, knock wood, but I haven't run into anything yet that I can't do in the web reporting studio that I was able to do in the client version. It's just the only thing is the interface is obviously different. The way that I got up to speed is just get in and start poking around. There is a user guide out there that's pretty helpful, but you know, user guides are 500 pages, and unless you have a specific question, it's kind of hard just to read through them. But I would recommend just getting in and, you know, creating some simple reports, getting familiar with where to click to get to different things.
Okay, great, thank you. The next question is, if we need to use comments on every single page of a report book, do we have to set up a new account and form for each different comment? Thank you.
You shouldn't have to. It could probably be done within the same form. It would just be multiple rows. But if they're at different intersections, you would have to, you know, if it's a different department, let's say, or a different organization, business unit, you could use the same account, you know, like I had in my example, a comments member, a text member within the account dimension. So it would still be at that comments member, but then if it was different organizations, let's say you might want to list those down your rows so you could have it all on one form and all the entry could be done from, you know, a single screen instead of having to choose from a drop-down menu, for instance. That could just make the user experience a little bit better.
Okay, great, thank you. One more question just came through. Have you experienced any issues migrating financial reporting objects to PBCS? I
have not. I mean, from the interface that I saw, it looks to work the same as, you know, if you're migrating on-premise from development to production. It's a simple within, well, there's two ways we can do reports. We could either do an export out of the old and import into PBCS, or I believe we could still do lifecycle management. I haven't tried that method myself, but I haven't, yeah, I see the functionality as being the same.
Great, thank you. Does anybody have any other questions? That's all I'm seeing.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you for attending. And I think, Erica, you said the slides will be posted out there. So here's my contact information if you do have questions you think of in the future.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.